Hello. Today I want to talk to you about James Damore's diversity memo at Google, which he was fired for. I hope that you've already heard about it before watching this video. Being a female engineer, a few people I know were interested in my point of view on what happened, and I was actually really horrified by some of the representation of the memo in the mainstream media. So, because I was interested in the memo as soon as it came out, and as soon as it came out, I read it. And when some media like the BBC and the Telegraph and the Guardian started writing about it, I read their articles, and then I went back and read the memo just to make sure I hadn't missed something, because how they were representing it did not seem to be the memo that I had read at all. I'm going to read you some of the things that they said, and you should really read the memo yourself if you're interested in the subject, because, as I say, the representation of it in the news was really not good, in my opinion. And I don't think it is a matter of opinion, really. I mean, they simply said that he said things that he wasn't saying at all, or took tiny parts of his memo that were insignificant compared to the overall message, and made that seem like the most important thing he was saying. So what I mean is that in the memo, it's about 8 to 10 pages long, depending on how big the pages are, but he spent an awful lot of those pages talking about diversity of opinion and why it's important to have diversity of opinion as well as diversity of gender and race and background in a company. He made it very clear that diversity was important to him, and that he wanted more female engineers in his company. He even gave 4 suggestions to how Google might be able to encourage more women to apply for engineering positions. But what he was mostly talking about was female and male preferences, and the different choices that men and women make in their careers, about what job to take, what aspirations they have for how high up in the company they're going to get, how much they want to work overtime, and that sort of thing. So the only part of the entire memo where he mentioned the difference in ability of women compared to men in engineering and programming was fairly near the start. What he said was, "I'm simply saying that the distribution of preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes." And then he goes into those biological causes with reference to evolution and prenatal testosterone and some fairly basic biological science. Now, that quote that I just read to you it was quoted by the BBC in their article about the memo and how he was fired afterwards. But the part that they quoted, and only this, was, "Abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes." So that's not what he said. What he said was the distribution, which is important, that's an important part of the sentence, the distribution of preferences, he leads with preferences, and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes. So even though they were taking a direct quote, it was completely misrepresentative of not only that sentence but the entire memo. And this was absolutely shocking to me. The BBC has been my main source of news. It's not the only source of news that I use, but I generally I watch BBC News, I listen to the radio, Radio 2, Radio 4, whatever, BBC Network, and I read their webpage. So to see that they were, as far as I can see, they were intentionally misrepresenting what he said, and this was common. This is remarkably common, and I've now started to really doubt. I mean, I thought I was skeptical before about news outlets and media, and yeah, of course everyone's got their bias, and you can't really trust any of them to be neutral, but I never really expected them to be so dishonest about something that was so easy to check. That it's so easy to go back and read his memo and check what they said about it against what he wrote. It's not a very long memo, it's really easy to find online. So to just misrepresent it like that, I think, is absolutely outrageous. I'll read you some more quotes from different news outlets that I thought were as bad, although, as I said, the BBC came as a shock because that's sort of one of my most trusted sources. But so the first person to get their message out about the memo was a woman named Danielle, who works at Google as the diversity manager. I can't remember what her title is, but she's in head of diversity at Google, so obviously she had a good reason to say what she wanted about it. What she said was that he was expressing views on the natural abilities and characteristics of different genders. And there's that word again, abilities, a word that Damore only used once in the entire memo, in the sentence that I just read to you, where he then went on to talk an awful lot about preferences and biological differences that were partial explanations for those differences. In preference only. He talked only about preference. He talked about females' preferences, he talked about males' preferences. He didn't say anything about how good women are at engineering or maths, or he didn't say anything about their abilities or their intellectual minds. He was just talking about their preferences. I can't emphasize that enough. If you don't believe me, you can read it, and maybe you think I'm exaggerating, but he really didn't talk about their abilities at all, okay? So, the first person to write about it, Danielle, the spokesperson for Google's diversity department, I don't know what it is, but she, right off the bat, misrepresented it. Later, when James Damore was fired, the CEO of Google said, "To suggest a group of our colleagues have traits that make them less biologically suited to that work is offensive and not okay." That work being Google's work. Again, James Damore did not say anything about his colleagues. What he was talking about was potential applicants for jobs at Google, or just applicants for engineering jobs in general. He was talking about the representation of jobs, of the genders within the engineering departments and the hiring policy. He wasn't talking about the female colleagues at his work. He didn't mention them at all. As far as he was concerned, as far as I can tell, the colleagues who had made it there had already proven that they were interested in programming because they applied for a programming job and they worked there 5 days a week. Probably worked very hard. So, to say that James Damore was talking about his colleagues in a derogatory manner and saying they weren't biologically suited to the work is ridiculous. What he was talking about was the people applying for the jobs and why fewer women were applying for engineering jobs. Nothing to do with his colleagues, okay? But it's biologically suited. That comes back later, okay? As soon as, well, I don't know the exact timeline, but people are using biologically suited or biologically fitting, or they use this general term, biologically suited, to talk about women, as in that's what they say James Damore was talking about, was how well biologically suited women are to certain jobs. But again, I think that's misrepresenting what he's saying. There's not biologically suited sounds like you're no good for this job, whereas what he was saying was they don't want that job, they didn't ask for it. Something else I wanted to say is that to become an engineer of any sort these days, you have to have a 3 or 4 year degree. You have to go to university for 3 or 4 years to get that degree, and it's not something you do unless you really want to do it. You have to be in the... Not that many people become engineers because not many people want to be engineers. So just to do an engineering degree and then to become an engineer, you have to really want to be an engineer. So preferences matter an awful lot when it comes to careers that you need a degree for in general, because you need to have quite a lot of motivation to put yourself and get into all that debt and study pretty hard. I mean, my degree was extremely difficult. It's much harder than being an engineer in some ways. So anyway, preferences matter an awful lot in jobs like that. Okay. The Huffington Post actually did an okay article about it, and I say okay in that they didn't blatantly lie about anything that he said. They quoted huge parts of it correctly. They quoted the memo in huge paragraphs and sort of broke them down. I mean, they gave an analysis that isn't quite what I would say about it, but I think they were fairly fair, given their bias. So, but right at the end of the Huffington Post article, their sort of zinger at the end, or their last line is, "Girls can't code. All Google is saying is, yes they can, if given the chance." That's not discrimination, as Mr. Damore asserts, that's justice. Okay, so girls can't code? No one ever said that. James Damore never said that. Nobody is saying that. Nobody is saying that girls can't code. That many girls can code, I'm sure. I think anyone who's literate and is given is trained to code could probably code. I think it's absolutely ridiculous to say that girls can't code, or to say that James Damore said that. He didn't say anything like that. He didn't say about women's abilities to learn to code or their abilities to code. It's just not part of what he said at all. So, if you're interested, you can read that article. The Independent, in their opening line, said that a widely shared internal Google memo arguing against diversity. That's their description of the memo that James Damore wrote. Arguing against diversity is simply not true. He was arguing against the methods that Google were using to increase diversity, which he thought were immoral. He thought that they were discriminating in favour of women, and I can see why he thought that, since it seems, from what he described, it seems like that was the case. So to say that he was anti-diversity is untrue. It's they, like I said before, they either didn't read it, or they didn't understand it, or they're lying. So the Metro wrote the worst article I read about the subject. They completely went off the rails and basically made up everything that he said. They said that they took one tiny mention he made of the gender pay gap, where he said that, I think he made a reference to it and said that it was non-existent. Then he cited some kind of economic study about differences between men and women's pay. So the only thing he said about the gender pay gap was that it didn't exist. So whether you believe that or not, I'll read you what the Metro said about it. His pseudo-scientific rant against women receiving equal pay for doing the exact same job. That's how they described the memo. He defended the gender pay gap using the ridiculous argument that women biologically have higher anxiety and lower stress tolerance, directly contradicting his own claims that women's salaries should be considered individually rather than as a group. what he calls tribalism. Okay? That's ridiculous. He never said anything about women doing the same getting the same pay for equal work. He didn't mention women's wages at all in the whole thing. Like I said, apart from a brief alluding to the gender pay gap. It's true, he did say that women's salaries should be considered on a case-to-case basis. Every single person's should be. That does not contradict what he said about women's higher anxiety and lower stress tolerance. I think whoever wrote this Metro article does not understand statistical distribution and what the entire science of statistics. So to say that that women have a higher distribution of anxiety and lower stress tolerance does not mean that every single woman has higher anxiety and lower stress tolerance. That's obvious. So women have distributed a lower height, physical height than men. They're shorter on average. That does not mean that, to say that each of their height should not be considered independently because women are shorter than men, so why even bother assessing their heights or whatever. That's basically what they said was completely incorrect. So I actually have, because this article was so bad, and I encourage you to read it and to read the memo just so you could see how bad their representation was. I really believe this one is a case of not understanding the memo, and probably intentionally misrepresenting it as well, just because he never mentioned the pay gap, as I said. So none of them, by the way, mentioned that he has a bachelor's degree in molecular biology and a master's degree in systems biology. Not a single outlet that I could see mentioned the fact that he had qualifications from Harvard University in America in biology. So I'm not saying that everything he said was absolutely correct. I'm not a biologist. I have no idea. I'm not really familiar with the literature about gender differences and the preferences of women over men, or these traits that he talked about. But I do know that I read his memo. I didn't think it was offensive or angry or a tirade of any sort. I thought it was fairly intelligent. I don't know if it was correct. I certainly wouldn't have fired him if he wrote that at a company I ran. But what really upset me was the fact that every news outlet that I trust misrepresented everything that he said. So that's my stance on the matter. I think I've said everything I wanted to about that. Thank you for watching. Please leave comments if you disagree with anything I said or if you agreed with it. Thank you.